Rain fell in thin silver threads over the city that autumn evening, tapping against the tall glass doors of a hotel, so polished it seemed to glow even under a gray sky. Marcus Williams stepped out of a taxi, with a worn leather duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his coat damp from the walk between the curb and the entrance, his eyes tired from a flight that had crossed nearly half the country. He smiled at the doorman, nodded once, and walked toward the front desk with the quiet confidence of a man who simply wanted a bed, a shower, and a few hours of peace before an important meeting the next morning. He had no idea that within a matter of hours, the very people about to humiliate him would be standing in a boardroom, staring at a screen, watching their own cruelty played back to them in silence. He had no idea that this ordinary night, this ordinary request for a room, was about to become the moment everything changed. And neither did the young woman behind the marble counter, who glanced up, took one look at his plain jacket and tired eyes, and decided, in less than 3 seconds, exactly what kind of man she believed him to be. Marcus had grown used to the particular exhaustion that came with travel, the ache in his shoulders from carrying his own bag through terminals, the dryness in his throat from recycled airplane air, the low hum of fatigue that settled behind his eyes after too many hours spent in transit. He had left home 2 days earlier for a series of meetings in another city, meetings that had run long and left him with barely enough time to catch his connecting flight. And now, standing in a lobby dressed in warm light and quiet luxury, all he wanted was somewhere soft to rest his head before the most important conversation of his professional life the following morning. He was not a man who needed grand gestures or extravagant comforts. He simply wanted what any traveler wanted: a clean room, a locked door, and a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. Nothing about that request seemed unreasonable to him as he crossed the lobby floor, and nothing about it should have been. The hotel stood 31 stories tall in the heart of downtown, its lobby dressed in dark marble and gold trim, chandeliers throwing warm light across leather armchairs, where wealthy guests sipped coffee and read newspapers as if the world outside did not exist. Marcus Williams was 42 years old, a man who had built 2 companies from nothing before either had ever heard his name spoken with respect, a man who now sat on the board of one of the largest investment funds in the country, though nothing about his appearance that evening suggested any of it. He wore a plain gray jacket, jeans that had seen better days, and sneakers scuffed from years of walking through airports more often than he walked through his own front door. He had been traveling for over 10 hours, first a delayed flight, then a layover that stretched far longer than it should have, and all he wanted now was a single night of rest before a meeting that would determine the direction of an enormous investment decision. He approached the front desk the way he approached most things in life, calmly, politely, expecting nothing more than basic courtesy in return. The young woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Ashley Turner, did not look up right away. When she finally did, her eyes moved over him slowly, from his shoes to his jacket to his tired face, and something in her expression shifted, hardened, closed itself off before he had even spoken a single word. Ashley Turner had worked at the front desk for nearly 2 years, and in that time, she had developed a private, unspoken system for deciding who deserved her full attention and who did not. She believed, the way certain people convince themselves of comfortable lies, that she could tell a person's bank account simply by studying their clothes, their shoes, the way they carried themselves through a lobby built for people who belonged there. Marcus offered a polite good evening and asked whether a suite was available for the night, his voice calm, unhurried, carrying no trace of irritation despite his exhaustion. Ashley did not return the greeting. She glanced past him toward the door, as though hoping someone more interesting might walk through it, and told him, without checking any system, without lifting a single finger toward her keyboard, that the hotel was fully booked. It was, of course, not fully booked at all. 2 guests behind Marcus were checked in within minutes, offered rooms on the 17th floor with a view of the river, treated with smiles and small pleasantries that Marcus had not been offered even once. The lobby, full of quiet conversation and the soft clink of coffee cups, seemed to absorb the injustice without anyone noticing it was happening at all. He thought, briefly, of the first time something similar had happened to him, decades earlier, when he was barely 20 years old and had walked into a rental office wearing a work uniform still smudged with grease from an afternoon shift, only to be told, with a dismissive wave of a hand, that the apartment he had called about that morning had suddenly been rented to someone else. He had not understood back then the quiet mechanics of the world that allowed such things to happen so easily, so casually, without anyone ever having to say the real reason out loud. He understood it now, had understood it for years, had learned to recognize the particular silence that settled over a room whenever someone decided he did not belong in it. That silence had a shape to it, a weight, and he felt it settling over him again now, standing in this lobby, waiting for a room key that was clearly never going to be handed to him, no matter how patiently he waited. Marcus felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever a moment like this arrived, a feeling he had learned to recognize decades ago, and had trained himself never to let control his voice or his face. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, laying his credit card on the counter along with his passport and a government identification card, offering them not as proof of worth but simply as the paperwork any traveler might present. Ashley barely glanced at them. She pushed the items back toward him with two fingers, as if they might carry something unpleasant, and said, in a tone flattened by practiced indifference, that the hotel did not have accommodations for people like him. The words landed heavier than she likely intended, though intention rarely softens the damage of a sentence like that. A woman nearby, seated in one of the leather chairs with a magazine open on her lap, glanced up and let out a short, careless laugh before returning her eyes to the page. Marcus said nothing. He simply stood there, steady, absorbing the moment the way a man absorbs weather he cannot control, waiting to see how far this evening intended to go before it finally broke. Ashley leaned slightly forward, lowering her voice, as though offering him a piece of helpful advice rather than an insult wrapped in false concern, and suggested that perhaps a motel a few blocks away might suit him better, somewhere more within his budget, somewhere more comfortable for someone dressed the way he was dressed. A young couple near the elevator turned to watch, whispering to each other, their expressions caught somewhere between amusement and discomfort, unwilling to intervene, but unable to look away. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, not from anger, but from the exhausting familiarity of it all. The sense of having lived this exact scene before, in different cities, different lobbies, different decades of his life. He asked, calmly, whether she had actually checked the system for availability, and she told him, without a flicker of hesitation, that she did not need to check anything because she already knew the answer. It was at that moment that a security guard, a broad-shouldered man in a dark uniform, began making his way toward the front desk, summoned by nothing more than a glance and a small nod from Ashley herself, as though Marcus had done something requiring intervention simply by standing there and asking for a room. The guard stopped a few feet away, his posture stiff, his tone polite but firm, informing Marcus that if there was no reservation, he would need to step outside the lobby. Marcus looked at him, then back at Ashley, and something in his expression settled into a kind of quiet stillness, the look of a man deciding not to fight a battle that was never meant to be fought with raised voices. He did not argue. He did not raise his hands or his tone or demand to see a manager the way another person might have, red-faced and shouting, giving them exactly the spectacle they seemed to be expecting from him. Instead, he asked one simple question, his voice even, almost gentle, asking whether this was truly the hotel's final decision, whether there was truly no room to be found for him that night. Ashley crossed her arms and said yes, firmly, with the confidence of someone who believed she would never have to answer for the words leaving her mouth. Marcus nodded once, thanked her with a politeness that seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could have, and turned toward the door, his duffel bag still slung over one shoulder, rain still falling steadily beyond the glass. He walked out into the wet evening without looking back, without a single glance toward the lobby where a few guests still watched him go, some with pity, some with indifference, none with the decency to speak up on his behalf. He crossed the street beneath an awning, pulled his phone from his pocket, and dialed a number he rarely used outside of matters that required absolute discretion. The call connected after 2 rings, and Marcus spoke only a handful of words, his voice quiet, controlled, carrying none of the humiliation he had just endured. He said simply that he needed something verified, gave an address, gave a time, and asked that no one on the receiving end reveal who had made the request. Whoever answered on the other end did not ask questions, did not hesitate, simply confirmed that it would be handled quietly and immediately. Marcus ended the call, tucked his phone away, and stood beneath the awning for a long moment, watching the rain fall over a city that had no idea what was about to happen to one of its most celebrated hotels. What none of the guests in that lobby understood, what Ashley Turner could not possibly have known, as she straightened papers at her desk and congratulated herself on maintaining what she believed was the hotel's exclusive standard, was that the man she had just turned away held far more power over the building than anyone inside it that evening. Marcus Williams was not simply a tired traveler with a wrinkled jacket and scuffed shoes. He was a senior investor and board member at one of the country's most influential private equity funds, a fund currently deep in negotiations to inject hundreds of millions of dollars into the very hotel chain that owned this property, along with dozens of others scattered across the nation. The following morning's meeting was not a minor appointment squeezed between flights. It was the final decision point, the moment when Marcus and his colleagues would determine whether this hotel chain would receive the capital needed to expand into 20 new cities, or whether the entire deal would be quietly shelved and offered instead to a competing chain waiting eagerly in the wings. Marcus had insisted, weeks earlier, that no one at the hotel be informed of his visit in advance, a decision his colleagues had questioned at the time, but ultimately respected, because Marcus believed, with a conviction shaped by his own life experience, that numbers on a balance sheet could never reveal the truth about a company's character. He wanted to see how ordinary guests were treated when no executive was watching, when no camera crew followed behind him, when he was simply another man walking through a lobby in wrinkled clothes after a long flight. He had done this before, quietly, at other properties considering partnerships with his fund, and more often than not, the results confirmed what the paperwork already suggested. This time, however, the results had confirmed something far darker, something that had nothing to do with financial competence and everything to do with the culture simmering beneath the marble floors and gold trim. As he stood in the rain that evening, Marcus was not thinking about revenge. He was thinking about the countless people who might walk through that same lobby without ever having the power to expose what had just happened to him. The next morning arrived quietly at the hotel's corporate offices, where senior partnership executives gathered around a long glass table to prepare for the scheduled meeting with the investment fund's representative. Coffee was poured, folders were arranged, presentations were rehearsed one final time, and everyone in the room carried the calm confidence of people who believed the deal was already essentially finished. When the appointed hour arrived and the fund's representative failed to appear, a slight unease settled over the room, dismissed at first as nothing more than traffic or a delayed flight. Phone calls went unanswered. Emails sent to the usual contact returned no reply. The chief executive, a composed man named Richard Hensley, who had spent nearly 2 decades building this hotel chain into a respected national name, began to feel something colder settle in his stomach, a sense that something had gone wrong somewhere along the way, though he could not yet imagine what. Richard asked his assistant to pull the guest records for the previous evening, a routine request meant only to confirm whether their expected visitor had checked in under a different name for privacy purposes, as investors sometimes did. The search returned nothing. No reservation existed under any name resembling their contact. No room had been assigned, no keycard had been issued. Richard's unease deepened into something closer to alarm, and he asked his head of guest relations, a sharp, detail-oriented woman named Diane Cooper, to check the security footage from the front desk the previous night, simply to rule out any confusion about arrival times. Diane pulled up the footage without much concern, expecting nothing more than routine confirmation that their guest had simply not yet arrived. What she saw instead made her stop the recording almost immediately, her hand trembling slightly over the keyboard. her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the face of the man standing at the front desk the night before. A face she had seen in a private profile photo sent to select executives weeks earlier. A face she now realized had appeared on this footage under circumstances no one in that room could have anticipated. Diane called Richard into her office without explanation, closing the door behind him before pressing play on the recording. Together they watched, in complete silence, as Marcus Williams approached the front desk, offered a polite greeting, and was met with nothing but cold dismissal from a young receptionist neither of them had ever personally interacted with before that moment. They watched Ashley Turner glance at his clothing, watched her tell him the hotel was fully booked, when clearly it was not. Watched her push his identification back across the counter without so much as glancing at it. They watched the security guard approach, summoned for no reason other than the simple fact that a black man in ordinary clothing had dared to stand at the counter longer than 3 seconds. They watched Marcus Williams, the very man whose signature was meant to authorize hundreds of millions of dollars in expansion funding, walk quietly out of the lobby into the rain, treated exactly like someone unworthy of basic human courtesy. Richard sat back in his chair, his face pale, his hands pressed flat against the desk, as though trying to steady himself against the weight of what he had just witnessed unfold on that small screen. Diane thought, as she sat quietly reviewing older complaint logs that had apparently been dismissed without proper investigation, about a letter that had arrived at the corporate office nearly a year earlier, written by an elderly woman who described being spoken to as though she could not possibly afford the room she had already paid for in full. The letter had been filed away without response, marked resolved by a junior staff member who had never actually looked into the matter, and Diane felt a hot flush of shame rise in her cheeks as she realized how many voices like that one had likely gone unheard over the years, simply because no one with enough power had ever bothered to listen closely. She began pulling every complaint filed over the past 18 months, cross-referencing names, dates, and front desk staff schedules, building a picture far larger and far more troubling than a single evening involving a single employee. It was becoming clear that Ashley Turner's behavior, while especially blatant, had not existed in isolation. It had existed within a culture that had quietly permitted it, one complaint at a time, one dismissed letter at a time, for longer than anyone in that boardroom wanted to admit out loud. Word spread quickly through the executive floor, though Richard insisted the matter be handled with absolute discretion until they understood the full scope of what had happened. Diane pulled additional footage from earlier in the week, footage that revealed this was not an isolated moment of poor judgment, but rather a pattern stretching back months. Other guests treated with the same casual disrespect, based on nothing more than the clothes they wore or the color of their skin. A businessman in a wrinkled suit turned away one Tuesday evening. An elderly woman traveling alone spoken to with thinly veiled condescension. A family denied a room upgrade they had rightfully earned through years of loyalty, offered instead to a wealthier-looking couple who arrived 20 minutes later. Richard felt something heavy settle in his chest as the pattern revealed itself, a slow, sick realization that the hotel he had spent 2 decades building had allowed something rotten to take root beneath its polished surface, something he had never noticed because he had never needed to look. By mid-morning, Richard had gathered his senior leadership team into the same glass-walled boardroom where the investment meeting had been scheduled to take place, though now the mood inside carried none of the earlier confidence. He explained, as calmly as he could manage, exactly what had happened the previous evening, watching the color drain from several faces around the table as the weight of the situation settled over the room. Diane played the footage once more, this time for the full group, and no one spoke as Marcus Williams walked away from the counter for the second time, his dignity intact despite everything working against him in that moment. When the video ended, silence stretched across the table for nearly a full minute before anyone found the courage to speak. Richard finally broke it, his voice low, steady, though clearly shaken, asking the only question that mattered now, which was how they intended to face a man they had wronged so completely, a man who now held their entire future in his hands. Ashley Turner was called into a private meeting later that afternoon, unaware of exactly why she had been summoned, Assuming perhaps that some minor scheduling issue needed clarifying, she entered the room with the same casual confidence she carried at the front desk. That same certainty that she understood exactly how the world worked and exactly who deserved her attention. Richard asked her, without preamble, to walk him through what had happened at the front desk the previous evening, involving a guest in a gray jacket. Ashley hesitated for only a moment before explaining that she had simply followed her instincts, that the man had not looked like someone who belonged in a hotel of this caliber, that something about his appearance had told her all she needed to know. Richard asked whether she had checked his credit card. She admitted she had not. He asked whether she had verified his identification. Again, she admitted she had not. He asked, finally, the question that mattered most, asking exactly what evidence had led her to conclude that this particular guest could not afford a room, and Ashley found, for the first time in the conversation, that she had no answer at all. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably across the small office, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of rain still tapping against the window outside. Ashley shifted in her seat, her earlier confidence beginning to crack at the edges, replaced slowly by something closer to dawning fear, as she realized this was not a routine conversation about customer service standards. Richard explained, gently but firmly, exactly who the man in the gray jacket had been, watching Ashley's face shift from confusion to disbelief to something resembling horror as the full weight of her mistake settled over her. She stammered an apology, insisting she had not meant any harm, insisting she had simply been trying to protect the hotel's image, though even as the words left her mouth, they sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Richard reminded her, quietly, that protecting an image built on excluding people based on nothing more than their appearance was not protection at all, but rather the very thing capable of destroying everything the hotel claimed to represent. Diane Cooper joined the conversation shortly after, her expression carefully controlled, despite the anger she clearly still carried from watching that footage earlier in the day. She explained to Ashley that this was not simply a matter of a single guest treated poorly on a single evening, but rather evidence of a pattern that had apparently gone unchecked for far too long. A pattern that suggested certain guests were judged not by their ability to pay, but by assumptions rooted in something far uglier than mere carelessness. Ashley tried once more to explain herself, insisting that she had simply been cautious, that the hotel needed to maintain certain standards, though her voice grew smaller with each attempt, as though some part of her already understood there was no explanation capable of undoing what had already been done. Richard informed her, calmly but without room for negotiation, that the matter would now be handled according to the company's formal policies regarding guest discrimination, a process that would likely result in consequences far more serious than she had anticipated when she woke up that morning, expecting nothing more than an ordinary shift. That evening, Richard personally placed a call to the number his team had managed to trace back to Marcus, uncertain whether the call would even be answered, given everything that had transpired. To his relief, Marcus picked up on the third ring, his voice calm, giving no indication of anger despite everything he had endured less than 24 hours earlier. Richard introduced himself, his voice tight with something between shame and desperation, and asked, humbly, whether Marcus might be willing to return to the hotel to speak with him directly, not as an investor evaluating a business deal, but simply as a man who deserved a proper apology, delivered face to face. Marcus was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, long enough that Richard wondered whether the call had disconnected entirely before Marcus finally answered that he would come, not because he needed anything from the hotel, but because he believed some conversations mattered too much to have over a phone. Marcus arrived that evening dressed much the same as he had the night before, the same gray jacket, the same tired eyes, though something in his posture now carried a quiet weight that had not been there 24 hours earlier. Richard met him personally at the entrance, extending a hand that trembled slightly as Marcus shook it, guiding him not toward the front desk, but toward a private lounge where the two of them could speak without an audience of curious onlookers. Diane joined them shortly after, along with two other senior executives who sat quietly, unsure exactly what to say to a man whose trust their company had shattered so completely. in a matter of minutes the night before. Marcus settled into a leather chair, declined the coffee offered to him, and waited patiently for someone to speak first, carrying none of the anger the executives had clearly braced themselves to encounter. Before Richard spoke, Marcus took a moment to look around the small lounge, taking in the quiet details of the room, the soft lighting, the careful arrangement of furniture designed to put anxious guests at ease. And he found himself thinking about how easily comfort could be manufactured for those the hotel deemed worthy of it, while the same comfort remained entirely unavailable to those judged unworthy within seconds of walking through the door. He was not interested in punishing anyone out of spite, was not interested in watching careers collapse simply to satisfy some private sense of justice. What he wanted, more than anything, was clarity, an honest accounting of how something so basic as human dignity had become conditional within these walls, and whether the people sitting across from him were prepared to face that truth without flinching away from it. Richard began by apologizing, his voice steady, despite the discomfort clearly written across his face, acknowledging exactly what had happened, without excuses, without minimizing, without the careful corporate language so many companies reach for in moments like this. Marcus listened quietly, his expression unreadable, until Richard finished speaking, and only then did he offer his own thoughts, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight that filled the entire room. He explained that this had not been the first time something like this had happened to him, not by a wide margin, that he had faced similar treatment in cities across the country over the course of decades, sometimes subtle, sometimes as blatant as what had occurred the previous evening. He explained that what hurt him most was never the loss of a room for a single night, something easily solved with a phone call or a short walk to another hotel. What hurt him most, he said, was the quiet, casual certainty with which people decided his worth before he had spoken more than a handful of words, the assumption that his appearance alone told the whole story of who he was and what he had built. The room remained silent as Marcus spoke, each executive absorbing his words with a discomfort that came from recognizing an uncomfortable truth about the culture they had allowed to exist within their own walls. Diane found herself blinking back tears she had not expected, thinking of her own father, a man who had faced similar treatment decades earlier, though she had never fully understood until this moment exactly how deeply that kind of humiliation could linger. Richard sat with his hands folded tightly in his lap, absorbing every word, understanding now that no financial explanation, no operational excuse, could soften the truth of what his company had allowed to happen beneath its own roof. Marcus did not raise his voice once during the conversation, never resorted to blame or anger. Yet his calm, steady honesty carried more weight than any outburst could have managed, settling over the room like something heavy and undeniable that none of them could simply walk away from. Marcus finally addressed the matter everyone in the room had been waiting to hear, the question of what would happen to the investment deal now hanging in uncertain limbo after everything that had unfolded. He explained, without hesitation, that he believed deeply in investing, not merely in buildings and balance sheets, but in the people responsible for running them day after day, because no amount of marble flooring or gold trim could compensate for a culture built on quiet cruelty toward the very guests a hotel claimed to serve. He informed Richard that the investment would be placed on hold, not canceled outright, but paused until the hotel demonstrated genuine, measurable change rather than a hastily assembled public apology designed only to protect its reputation. He outlined exactly what that change would require: a complete overhaul of front desk training procedures, mandatory education on unconscious bias and discrimination for every employee across every property in the chain, and the establishment of a transparent, accessible system through which guests could report mistreatment without fear of it disappearing quietly into a drawer somewhere. Diane spoke up then, her voice quiet but firm, adding one more condition of her own to the list already forming on the table between them. She proposed that the hotel establish a scholarship program for young people from underserved communities interested in pursuing careers in hospitality management, a program designed not as a public relations gesture, but as a genuine investment in the kind of leadership capable of reshaping an industry from the inside out. Marcus considered the idea carefully, nodding slowly, telling her that real change rarely came from policy alone, that it required new voices entering the room, with the authority to challenge old habits before those habits had the chance to calcify into something permanent. Richard agreed immediately, promising to fund the program personally, rather than folding it quietly into the company's existing charitable budget, wanting it to carry the weight of a genuine commitment rather than a convenient line item easily forgotten within a few fiscal years. Richard agreed to every condition without hesitation, understanding clearly that this was not a negotiation, but rather an opportunity, perhaps the only one his company would receive, to prove that the values it claimed to hold were more than words printed on a mission statement somewhere in a forgotten employee handbook. Diane began outlining a plan on the spot, promising a complete audit of hiring practices, ongoing training sessions led by outside experts rather than internal staff, eager to minimize the issue, and a formal review process for every complaint filed by a guest, regardless of how minor it initially seemed. Marcus listened carefully to each proposal, occasionally offering a quiet suggestion or a pointed question that revealed exactly how seriously he intended to hold them accountable moving forward. As for Ashley Turner, the matter had already been handled according to the company's formal policy regarding guest discrimination, a decision that ultimately resulted in the end of her employment there, a consequence she had never imagined possible when she woke up that ordinary autumn morning, believing herself entirely justified in every decision she had made. Word of what happened traveled quietly through the hotel's corporate offices over the following weeks, though Richard insisted the story never be used as a public spectacle or a marketing opportunity, understanding that turning Marcus's humiliation into a headline would only compound the very harm they were trying to repair. Instead, the changes unfolded gradually, almost invisibly to anyone outside the company, beginning with a complete redesign of front desk training that emphasized listening over assumption, verification over instinct, and respect as a baseline expectation, rather than something extended selectively based on appearance. New employees were required to complete extensive training on unconscious bias before ever stepping behind a front desk, guided by instructors brought in specifically for their expertise in workplace discrimination, rather than internal staff eager to move quickly past an uncomfortable subject. Diane personally oversaw the creation of a guest feedback system that ensured every complaint, no matter how small it seemed on the surface, received a documented review rather than a quiet dismissal. One afternoon during that period of change, a middle-aged man named Walter Briggs walked into the lobby wearing a paint-stained jacket, having come straight from a job site to check in before an early morning appointment across town. A young front desk employee greeted him warmly, asked about his day, checked him in without a moment's hesitation, and wished him a restful night before he made his way toward the elevator. Walter paused near the concierge desk afterward, remarking quietly to no one in particular that it had been a long time since he felt so welcome somewhere, so clearly out of his usual price range, unaware that his small comment had been overheard by Diane, who happened to be passing through the lobby at that exact moment. She said nothing to him directly, not wanting to make him feel singled out, but she carried that quiet moment with her for the rest of the evening, a small, ordinary proof that the changes taking root inside these walls were beginning to mean something real to the people who walked through them every single day. Months passed, and the hotel that had once nearly destroyed its own future in a single careless evening began to look, at least in the quiet moments that mattered most, genuinely different from the inside out. Employees greeted every guest with the same warmth regardless of what they wore or how they carried themselves through the lobby, understanding now that dignity was not something to be measured against a person's clothing or the confidence of their stride. Richard visited the front desk personally at least once a week, not to inspect or intimidate, but simply to observe, to listen, to ensure that the changes taking root were genuine, rather than performative window dressing, meant only to satisfy an investor watching from a distance. Diane often stood quietly near the elevators during evening shifts, watching new employees interact with guests, feeling a quiet pride whenever she witnessed someone extend the same courtesy to a traveler in wrinkled clothes as they did to one arriving in a tailored suit. On a quiet evening nearly 6 months after that first difficult night, Marcus returned to the hotel once more, though this time no one behind the front desk recognized him. No whispered warning passed between employees anticipating his arrival. He wore the same style of simple clothing he always preferred when traveling: a plain jacket, comfortable shoes, nothing designed to announce his position or wealth to anyone paying attention. A young employee behind the counter, someone hired well after the changes had taken root, looked up as he approached, offered a genuine smile, and greeted him warmly, asking how his day had been before he had even finished stating his name. She checked her system, found a room available without hesitation, and handed him his key, with the same courtesy she would have extended to anyone walking through those doors that evening. Marcus thanked her, took his key, and made his way toward the elevator, feeling something settle quietly in his chest, something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, like genuine peace rather than quiet resignation. He thought, as he waited for the elevator to arrive, about how strange it was that something so ordinary, a simple greeting, a moment of eye contact, a willingness to check a system before making an assumption, could carry so much weight when it was finally offered without hesitation. He had spent so many years learning to brace himself for disappointment in moments exactly like this one, learning to keep his expression neutral, his voice calm, his expectations low enough that rejection could never fully surprise him. Standing here now, key in hand, he allowed himself something he rarely permitted: a small, private moment of genuine relief. The quiet understanding that change, however slow and however difficult to measure, was still entirely possible when the right people finally decided to look honestly at themselves. He paused near the elevator doors and glanced back toward the front desk one final time, watching the young woman greet the next guest in line with that same unwavering warmth, unaware that the man she had just checked in held the power to end her hotel's future with a single phone call, unaware that he no longer needed that power to feel satisfied with what he saw unfolding in front of him. This, he thought, was exactly what he had hoped to find when he first insisted on visiting the property, unannounced all those months earlier. Not a hotel terrified into compliance by the threat of lost investment, but one that had genuinely re-examined what it meant to treat every single person who walked through its doors with basic human respect. The elevator doors opened, and Marcus stepped inside, the quiet hum of the building rising softly around him as the doors slid closed and carried him upward, leaving behind a lobby that finally looked the way it always should have. Years later, long after the investment had been finalized and the hotel chain had expanded into new cities exactly as originally planned, Richard would still occasionally tell the story to new executives joining the company, not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten them into compliance, but as a reminder of how quickly an entire institution's integrity could hinge on a single interaction between one employee and one stranger standing at a counter. He would explain that the true measure of any company was never found in its glossy annual reports or its carefully worded mission statements, but in the smallest, quietest moments, the ones that unfolded when no camera was rolling and no executive was watching, the ones that revealed exactly who an organization chose to become when it believed no one of consequence was paying attention. Marcus never asked for credit, never wanted his name attached to the story in any public way, content instead, to know that somewhere, in a lobby he rarely visited anymore, strangers were finally being seen for who they were, rather than judged for what they appeared to be. Respect, in the end, was never meant to be a privilege reserved for those wearing the right clothes or carrying the right title, never meant to be extended selectively based on a stranger's quick, careless judgment formed in the span of a few seconds at a counter. It was meant, from the very beginning, to be something every person received simply by virtue of walking through a door and asking, politely, for nothing more than basic human decency in return. Marcus Williams never sought recognition for what he had done, never wanted his name attached to headlines or turned into a symbol for a cause he had never intended to champion publicly. He simply wanted, on one ordinary rainy evening, to be seen for exactly who he was rather than judged for what he appeared to be. And in the months that followed, that simple, quiet wish became something far larger than either he or anyone inside that hotel could have fully anticipated on the night it all began.